today's modern American society, there seems to be a growing resistance to the idea of Christian personal values and tradition. What started as a few colonies with a clear defined religious belief and value system has now become unrecognizable. For those of us who love God, we strive to uphold the ideals and standards set forth by His Word. We sacrifice on a daily basis our own needs and desires to further the message of the good news of Jesus Christ. Yet it would seem, through mainstream media and various social platforms, there is a clear message coming from many. And the message they deliver is this: your values and traditions are no longer welcome. Your views are antiquated and in drastic need of modernization. Your views are oppressive, unaccepting, and destructive. You are no longer welcome in society unless you are willing to compromise and agree that we are right. This is an outright demand for God's church to align themselves officially with the current political movement happening within society today. However, we know that Christ will return for a bride without spot or wrinkle, which means that we, being filled with the Spirit, could never look the world in the eye and say, "I agree with you," because to do so would imply that we have been lying this entire time. If we say we are wrong now, that would mean that we had always been wrong. Yet we know God has never changed His standard for righteousness. And so this brings us to a series of questions that in most cases seem not to have been answered satisfactorily. As the world grows darker around us and more evil, where do we fit in as God's children? How do we be in the world but not of the world? How can we dwell in the middle of all this and still be an effective witness for Christ? Is it worth it to live a Christian life? And most importantly, how much compromise is too much compromise? When this country was first founded, Christian values were the cornerstone of all aspects of life. They were reflected in law, business, and society as a whole. Prayer was instituted before the courts opened, and even Congress would pray for 2 hours, asking God for His guidance as they sought to make decisions that would affect generations to come. Until recent history, these values and ideals remained. They were at the core of our society. However, recently, people who no longer want to live by these values have begun to form minority groups and stage a direct assault on both our right to have an opinion separate from theirs and to live according to our faith in God. The raw amount of hate, intolerance, and in some cases, even violence towards the church is staggering. More than 200 groups and organizations are openly anti-Christian. They try to silence us or remove all public displays of Christian heritage and faith, and attack anyone who would dare express an opinion different from theirs. One dangerous part of this progression is the idea that it is okay to rewrite history. Many of these groups lobby the government to remove statutes and landmarks which are memorials of our past. They call them racist, saying that if they're not removed, it could ruin future generations. And even textbooks are being rewritten in schools to reflect the current narrative rather than what has actually taken place in our history. What makes this so damaging is that a wise person learns from their past mistakes. Instead of trying to hide these bad choices, they should instead be used as a platform for teaching younger generations the consequences of living an immoral life. And so by removing these things from the public, they only reinforce their own opinions rather than the truth. All of these ideas and changes can have a devastating effect. One example can be found in a recent ruling in California law. California became the first state to enact certain rights for transgender kindergarten through 12th grade students in state law. This required public schools to allow those students access to whichever restroom and locker room they wanted. Many parents were so outraged, they immediately took their children out of public schools. Right now, as you watch this video, there are Christians in this country who are being taken to court simply for living according to their faith. There are Christians who are being physically assaulted in this country. There are Christians who are losing their jobs, being protested, and even receiving death threats, all happening in the United States of America. There have been mass shootings in recent years. I'm not talking about Burkina Faso, Egypt, or China. I'm not talking about other countries where Christianity is illegal. I'm not talking about other countries where Christians are martyred. I'm talking about the United States of America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. I'm talking about a country that once prided itself on the fact that it took in others who were in distress and gave them the freedom to worship God as they saw fit. Right here in our own country, the ability to openly live as a Christian and share the good news of Jesus is under siege by those who do not wish to hear their need for salvation. And so once again, where do we fit in as God's children? How do we be in the world but not of the world? How can we dwell in the middle of all this and still be an effective witness for Christ? Is it worth it to live the Christian life? And most importantly, how much compromise is too much compromise? In seeking answers for these questions, some very well-meaning people have sought to approach this problem from various angles. There are some who would take a radical approach, and in some cases, even performed violence against those who disagree with them. This is sad because not only is it ineffective in winning others to Christ, but it actually leads many to blaspheme God's name, because who would want to serve a God who would support that type of activity? Some seek compromise and look to find common ground so that the problem can be dealt with logically. However, this is also ineffective and becomes a slippery slope, quickly leading to such a watered-down gospel that the message begins to mirror the very people they seek to minister to. Some of us become so disgusted and aggravated at these issues that we separate ourselves completely from others except those who are in our church. Yet even this is unacceptable because we are called to be a bright light in a dark world. The gospel was not made for the four walls of the church, but for those who are lost and have a need for salvation. Now that we have a clear grasp of the problem at hand, let's look at what the scriptures say concerning the times we live in. 2 Timothy chapter 3, 1-7 says, "Know this also, that in the last days perilous times will come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, without self-control, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the authority thereof. From such turn away, for this sort are they which creep into houses, and lead captive silly women laden with sins, led away with diverse lusts, ever learning, and never able to come to the knowledge of truth." The times that we live in certainly seem to mirror this. Anyone can look at the news and see how perilous the days are. With all of the crime, riots, and mass shootings happening, many are becoming afraid to leave their home. Selfishness seems to be the standard rather than the exception. Honesty in many cases seems to be a thing of the past. And people seem to be more concerned with what makes them happy than what God desires. And so these people spend years going to college for politics, psychology, and different forms of higher learning in order to be able to explain why things are the way they are. But notice this passage says, ever learning, yet never able to come to the knowledge of truth. This is because all truth comes from God. You cannot learn the scriptures logically, it must be revealed. Likewise, you cannot pursue worldly knowledge and expect to come to the same truth that you find in God's Word. And so the warning here is that as we see things coming to pass in the world, we should be careful to avoid being drawn in and deceived, because the main tools that they use are based on emotion and physical desire. And as we just read, aside from sharing the good news of Jesus Christ, we should turn away from those and not allow ourselves to be drawn into their viewpoints and lifestyles. Daniel chapter 12 verse 1 says, "And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book." Does this sound familiar? The world really is in a state of turmoil that we've never seen before in history. While it's true that in the past, sections of the world have been engulfed in war, we have never seen a time when the entire world has endured such a high level of civil unrest. Now look at verses 3 and 10. Verse 3 says, "And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever." Verse 10 says, "Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand." Here we see that the people who live a righteous life will be a bright light in a dark world. It's interesting how if you turn a light on during the day, you don't see it very well. But if you turn it on at night, you can see it for miles. The more evil and dark this world gets, the brighter our light shines. And so the reason it says the wise will shine with the brightness of the stars is because the world will become so evil that God's people will stick out. The righteousness of God's church is a bold contrast to the world. And in verse 10 we see that as God goes through the process of transforming his people, those who reject Christ will continue doing evil. They will not understand what's really going on in the world. It says the wise will understand. Why? Remember, the Bible says the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And so the reason God's people will see these times and realize what's going on is because as we fully submit ourselves to God and study His Word, we see the signposts telling us what direction humanity is taking. Look at John 15:18 through 19. "If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hates you." Jesus warned us that if the world hated him, they were going to hate us too. It's unavoidable, and the outcome is predictable. Our righteous living and worship of the one true living God shines a light on other people's motives and thoughts and deeds. And so because we reveal the things other people want to hide, they become offended. The point of all this is that none of us should be taken by surprise. If we look at things as they are, the situation is easy to understand. Here we have a world that is moving farther and farther away from God. The result of that is increasing instability in the world and more trouble. For those of us who hold on to God's truth, our lifestyle reveals the uncleanliness of the world around us. And so they become angry and look for any means possible to silence us and hopefully just make us go away. So what do? What is the godly, effective response that His people should be committed to? First, we should have a clear understanding of where we are and what's going on in the world. As we place our faith and trust in God, we should focus on the fact that even though we're in the middle of all this, He is with us. And as we are confronted with all of the negativity and corruption, we must remind ourselves that as God has loved us and shown us great patience and kindness, we, as mirrors, should reflect the same love, patience, and kindness on the world. Instead of getting into arguments and debates which only produce conflict, instead, with humility, we should present Jesus through a lifestyle of righteous living and caring for others. Yes, we should vote. Yes, we should stand for what we know is right. But when dealing with people, it must be from a standpoint of caring. We should try to reach others because we love them, not for the sake of proving that we are right. Remember this: people are not what they do, but rather what they do comes from who they are. We were once equally lost and without hope, and so we do not judge others, but seek to bring the deliverance of the gospel because we know what it's like to be in that condition. The last question I want to look at is one that I've heard recently, and that is it worth it to go through the sacrifice and hardships that come along with being a Christian? My personal answer is absolutely. Without hesitation, I would tell anyone who is undecided that living a life in submission to God is the greatest choice I have ever made. Here's why. God promises that if I put my trust in Him, He will not only wipe away my past and make me righteous, but He will be with me every day of my life. As I go through all of the hardships, danger, and resistance from those who would stand against God, He promises that it will never be more than I can bear, and that He will protect me and take care of me. So not only does He pour out His grace into my life, but He rises up in my defense so that I will never be overwhelmed into failure. With God in your life, you cannot lose. I hope that you have found this video inspiring and helpful. If you have enjoyed it, make sure and subscribe and click on notifications so that you will receive upcoming videos. God bless you. Have a great day.